Hey everyone, and welcome back to the channel. Today we're diving deep into a topic that can genuinely transform our lives. Rain poured down in heavy sheets, soaking through Catherine's thin coat as she knelt on the cold concrete outside St. Mercy Hospital. Her hands were clasped so tightly that her knuckles had turned white, and her whispered prayers trembled through the storm. "Please, God, don't take my little girl, please," she murmured again and again, her voice almost lost in the rumble of thunder. Inside, beyond the glass doors that refused to open for her, her daughter Emily lay dying. The doctors had said the surgery could save her, but it would cost more than Catherine could ever hope to afford. She had sold everything she owned, her late husband's watch, her wedding ring, even her mother's old sewing machine, but it still wasn't enough. Now she had nothing left but faith. Passersby rushed past her, holding umbrellas, some glancing at her with pity, others with annoyance. One man laughed cruelly, muttering, "Look at her. Praying won't pay the bills." A nurse on a smoke break sneered, "Maybe your God can help you now." Catherine didn't respond. She didn't even lift her head. She just stayed there, soaked to the bone, whispering to the heavens as the rain washed over her. Her lips quivered with exhaustion, but her faith held firm. Then, out of the blur of headlights, a sleek black car rolled to a stop in front of her. The engine purred like something alive. The tinted window slid down, revealing a man in a sharp gray suit. His voice was calm but carried the weight of authority. "Ma'am," he said, looking down at her with curiosity, "why are you kneeling here in the rain?" Catherine looked up, her face streaked with water and tears. "My daughter, she's inside. She needs surgery. I can't afford it," she whispered. The man studied her for a moment, then reached into his briefcase and pulled out a folded sheet of paper. "I'll pay for everything," he said, "but you must sign this first." Catherine blinked, confused. "What is it?" she asked, taking the paper with trembling fingers. "It says," he explained smoothly, "that if your daughter survives, you will work for me, for the rest of your life." His tone was casual, as if it were the simplest business deal in the world. Catherine's heart stopped. "Forever?" she asked quietly. The man smiled thinly. "Think of it as a small price to pay for her life," he said, holding out a pen. The rain dripped from his sleeve, shining in the streetlight. Catherine hesitated, staring at the paper. Every part of her wanted to believe this man could be the answer to her prayers, but something about his calm, cold smile sent a chill down her spine. Still, she thought of Emily's pale face, the sound of her labored breathing, and the beeping monitors that marked her fading heartbeat. With a trembling hand, Catherine signed. "Good," the man said, taking the paper back with a satisfied nod. He stepped out of the car, closed his umbrella, and strode confidently into the hospital, leaving Catherine kneeling in the rain, her heart pounding with a mix of hope and dread. Inside the hospital, the man moved with purpose. Nurses turned to look at him as he passed, drawn by his commanding presence and the dripping rain on his expensive coat. When he reached the reception desk, he spoke with quiet authority. "I need to speak with the head surgeon immediately." The receptionist, startled by his tone, quickly picked up the phone. Within minutes, the chief doctor appeared, a weary man in his 50s with kind eyes behind thick glasses. "Sir, how can I help you?" he asked. The man handed him a card embossed with gold letters. "I'll be covering all expenses for the patient named Emily Johnson. She's in emergency care right now." The doctor blinked, surprised. "That's the girl with the heart defect," he said softly. "Her mother has been outside all day praying." The man nodded impatiently. "Yes, proceed with the surgery immediately. Money is no object." The doctor hesitated only a second before signaling his team. "Get the operating room ready," he ordered. As they rushed off, Catherine, who had followed the man inside, watched through the glass doors as nurses wheeled her daughter away. Her knees nearly gave out from relief. "Thank you," she whispered to the man. He only nodded, his expression unreadable. "Just remember our agreement," he said. Then he turned away, hands clasped behind his back, as if what he'd done was merely business. Hours crawled by like years. The storm outside softened to a drizzle, but the tension inside the waiting area remained thick. Catherine sat motionless in a hard plastic chair, her fingers clutching the silver cross around her neck. Every time the operating room door swung open, her heart leapt. She imagined Emily's tiny voice calling for her, imagined the soft smile that had once brightened their small apartment. She remembered all the nights Emily had asked, "Mom, do you think God listens to us?" And how she'd always answered yes, even when she wasn't sure herself. Now, that faith was all she had left. The man sat across from her, scrolling through his phone, his expression indifferent, though his jaw was tight. The hours dragged on until finally the operating room door opened one last time and the doctor stepped out, pulling off his mask. His face broke into a smile. "The surgery was a success," he announced. "Your daughter's going to be fine." Catherine's hands flew to her mouth as she let out a sob of joy. "Thank you, God," she cried, tears streaming down her cheeks. She sank to her knees again, this time in gratitude. The man stood up slowly, watching her. His lips curved into a faint smirk. "Now," he said quietly, "you work for me. Forever." Before Catherine could reply, the doctor approached him, his tone cautious. "Sir," he said, "could I speak with you privately?" The man frowned but nodded. They stepped aside, near the corridor where the lights flickered faintly. The doctor lowered his voice. "Earlier today, you were on the operating table yourself. You needed an emergency blood transfusion, remember?" The man nodded stiffly. "Yes, what about it?" The doctor hesitated, then continued. "We couldn't find your blood type in the hospital. It's extremely rare. But we had stored a small sample from one of our pediatric patients. Your blood type matched hers exactly. We used that sample to save your life." The man blinked, his composure cracking. "You're saying—" The doctor nodded. "It was Emily's blood that saved you. The little girl whose surgery you just paid for." For a long moment, the man didn't speak. The noise of the hospital seemed to fade away. His hands trembled slightly as he looked toward the recovery ward, where Catherine sat weeping with relief. The words echoed in his mind. "Her prayers saved your life." The man stood there frozen, the doctor's words echoing through his mind like thunder. He turned slowly, his gaze drifting to the small window that looked into the recovery room. Through the glass, he could see Catherine sitting beside her daughter's bed, her hands gently brushing the hair from Emily's pale forehead. The girl was awake now, weak but smiling, her small hand clutching her mother's. Catherine's face glowed with relief and exhaustion. Tears still streaked her cheeks, but they shone with gratitude, not pain. For a long moment, the man just watched them. This mother who had nothing but faith, and this child who, without even knowing it, had given him a second chance at life. His throat tightened. The pen in his pocket suddenly felt heavier than gold, and that folded paper in his briefcase, a single page signed under the rain, felt like a stain he couldn't justify. Slowly he walked toward Catherine. She didn't notice him at first, too lost in the gentle rhythm of her daughter's breathing. When she finally looked up, her eyes were red and tired, but kind. The man swallowed hard and said softly, "Ma'am, I owe you an apology." Catherine blinked, confused. "For what?" she asked quietly. He hesitated, searching for the right words. "That paper you signed? You don't owe me anything. Not your labor, not your life. It was your faith and your daughter that saved me." He pulled the contract from his briefcase. Rain spattered and creased and tore it in half. The sound was small but sharp, echoing through the quiet hallway. Catherine stared at him, speechless, as the torn pieces fell to the floor like wet leaves. "I was wrong," he said, his voice trembling. "I thought I was the one saving you, but it was God using you to save me." For the first time since meeting him, Catherine saw something real in his eyes. Not pride, not arrogance, but humility. The man turned to the doctor. "Send the bill to my office, every penny," he said, "and make sure this little girl gets whatever care she needs forever." Then he looked back at Catherine. "You've given me something I can't repay," he said quietly. Catherine shook her head, tears filling her eyes again. "I didn't give you anything," she whispered. "I just prayed." The man nodded slowly, almost smiling. "Maybe that's what I've been missing," he said. With that, he walked toward the exit, the sound of his shoes soft against the floor. Outside, the storm had passed, leaving the sky painted in shades of pale gold and gray. As he stepped into the cool air, a gust of wind caught the last remnants of the torn paper and carried them away. He looked up at the clearing sky, a strange peace settling in his chest. For the first time in years, he felt small and grateful. Back inside, Catherine sat beside Emily, holding her tiny hand. "Mom," the girl whispered, her voice weak but clear. "Did God hear you?" Catherine smiled, brushing away a tear. "Yes, sweetheart, he heard us both." Emily smiled faintly before drifting back to sleep, and Catherine closed her eyes, whispering a final prayer, not one of pleading this time, but of thanks. Outside the hospital, the man in the sharp suit lingered by his car for a long moment, watching the dawn break through the clouds. He took a deep breath and whispered to himself, "God had a plan all along." Months passed, and winter melted quietly into spring. The city streets that once felt cold and merciless began to bloom again, filled with the scent of fresh rain and new beginnings. Catherine now spent her days at the small corner cafe across from the hospital, where she worked part-time to stay close to Emily's doctors. She often sat by the window during her breaks, sipping weak coffee, her eyes drawn to the same glass doors she had once knelt before in the pouring rain. Life had not suddenly become easy, money was still scarce, and some nights were still long, but peace had taken root in her heart. Emily had recovered beautifully. The doctors called her a miracle, though Catherine always said, it wasn't a miracle, it was mercy. Emily had gone back to school, her laughter filling their small apartment again, and each time Catherine heard it, she felt the same quiet gratitude she had felt that night. Sometimes, when Emily slept, Catherine would find herself thinking about the man in the sharp suit, the stranger who had appeared from nowhere, demanded her signature, and then returned her dignity by tearing it away himself. She never knew his full name. The hospital had told her later that he was a powerful businessman, a man whose reputation had once been built on pride and deals that left no room for kindness. But something had changed in him after that night. Word spread that he had begun donating large sums to the children's wing at St. Mercy Hospital. The new wing bore a small plaque with no grand title, just a simple inscription, "In gratitude for second chances." One afternoon, Catherine was wiping down tables when the cafe door opened, and a familiar voice asked softly, "Do you still make your coffee too strong?" She looked up, startled. There he was, the same man but different somehow. His sharp suit had been replaced by something simple, his expression gentler, his presence humbler. "It's you," she said, her voice barely a whisper. He smiled faintly. "I wasn't sure you'd recognize me." She nodded. "I could never forget the man who helped save my daughter." He looked down, almost ashamed. "You were the one who saved me," he said quietly. They talked for a while, about Emily's recovery, about the hospital, about life. When she thanked him again for what he had done, he shook his head. "No, Catherine," he said. "Thank you. You reminded me that money isn't the only thing worth giving." Before leaving, he reached into his coat pocket and handed her an envelope. "Please don't refuse this," he said. "It's for Emily's education." Catherine opened her mouth to protest, but he gently raised his hand. "Let it be my way of saying thank you to both of you." Then he walked out into the sunlight, leaving her holding the envelope with trembling hands. Years later, when Emily graduated from college with honors, she stood on the stage and looked into the crowd. She spotted her mother in the front row, wiping tears from her eyes, and beside her sat the same man, older now, with graying hair and a proud smile. After the ceremony, Emily ran to him and hugged him tightly. "Mom always said you were an angel," she said with a grin. He chuckled softly. "I'm no angel, Emily. Just someone who got a second chance." Catherine joined them, and for a moment, the three stood together under the wide blue sky. As the sun began to set, Catherine thought back to that night of rain and despair. The cold pavement beneath her knees, the cruel laughter, the sharp suit, and the impossible offer. She thought about faith, about how sometimes prayers aren't answered the way we expect, but in ways that change more than we could imagine. And as she looked at her daughter, alive, smiling, full of promise, she felt a warmth in her heart that words could never touch. "God had a plan all along," she whispered again, the same words the man had spoken years ago. The wind carried them softly away, mingling with the laughter of her daughter and the quiet gratitude of a man who had once believed he could buy everything, until he learned that some things, like grace and redemption, could only ever be received. Years slipped by quietly, each one carrying the memory of that night like a gentle echo. Catherine grew older, her hair silvering at the temples, but her eyes never lost their calm light. She no longer worked at the cafe. Instead, she volunteered at the children's ward in St. Mercy Hospital, the very place where her prayers had once been answered. Every morning she brought homemade soup, tiny gifts, and soft blankets for the sick children. The nurses adored her, and the parents often said there was something about her presence that made the halls feel warmer. "You have the heart of a saint," one of them told her once. Catherine only smiled. "I don't," she replied quietly. "I just remember what it feels like to sit outside those doors and wait for a miracle." Emily had grown into a bright young woman, now studying to become a doctor. She often visited her mother at the hospital, wearing her white coat with quiet pride. "Mom," she would say, "I want to help people the way someone once helped us." Catherine always smiled when she heard that. She knew Emily's dream came from more than gratitude. It came from compassion, from the same unshakable faith that had carried them through the storm. The man in the sharp suit, whose name Catherine eventually learned was Robert Hale, had become a different man entirely. The newspapers no longer called him ruthless or feared him in business circles. He had sold half of his companies, poured his wealth into hospitals, shelters, and education programs. He founded a charity called the Second Chance Foundation, dedicated to helping families who couldn't afford medical care. He often said in interviews that it wasn't charity, it was repayment for a debt he could never fully settle. When asked what inspired him, he always paused before answering. "A mother who prayed in the rain, and a little girl who gave me her blood." Catherine and Robert stayed in touch through the years. Sometimes he would stop by the hospital, unannounced, with toys for the children or flowers for the nurses. The staff whispered about how odd it was, a powerful man quietly visiting a small-town hospital. But Catherine never saw him as powerful anymore. She saw him as human, as someone who had once been lost and found his way back to grace. They would sit on a bench outside the hospital, sharing coffee and talking about life, about how strange and beautiful redemption could be. One day, as they watched children play in the courtyard, Robert said softly, "You know, Catherine, I used to think that everything good in life had to be earned or bought, but that night taught me something. Some blessings are given freely, even when we don't deserve them." Catherine nodded, smiling. "That's what faith is," she said. "It's not a bargain. It's trust. A few years later, Robert fell ill. The hospital where he had once saved Emily's life became his refuge. Catherine visited him often, sitting by his bedside as the machines hummed softly. He was weaker, thinner, but his eyes were still clear. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked her one evening, his voice faint. "Signing that paper?" Catherine shook her head gently. "No," she said, "because it wasn't really about the paper. It was about surrender, mine and yours. We both had to let go before God could work." Robert smiled weakly. "You always had more faith than I did." She squeezed his hand. "Maybe, but you had the courage to change. That's faith too." He closed his eyes, the faintest smile on his lips. "Then maybe we both kept our promises." Those were the last words he spoke to her. When Robert passed away, the city mourned him, not as a tycoon, but as a man who had rebuilt lives. His will left generous donations to St. Mercy Hospital, including funds for a new pediatric wing named after Catherine and Emily. At the unveiling, Emily, now a young doctor, stood at the podium and spoke through tears. "This hospital isn't just where I was saved," she said. "It's where I learned what love, faith, and redemption truly mean." In the front row, Catherine sat quietly, her hands folded, looking up at the sign that read, "The Hale Family Children's Wing, dedicated to faith, hope, and second chances." After the ceremony, Catherine walked outside into the cool evening air. The sky was painted in soft pinks and golds, just like that morning years ago after the storm had cleared. She stood beneath the same tree where she once knelt in the rain and closed her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered, not just to God, but to the memory of the man who had once offered her a deal and found his own salvation instead. A gentle wind stirred the leaves, and Catherine smiled. Life had come full circle. What began in desperation had ended in grace. A mother's prayer had saved a daughter's blood had saved a man, and that man's redemption had saved countless others. Catherine turned toward the hospital one last time, the golden light reflecting in her eyes. "God had a plan all along," she said softly, and this time, she truly understood it. In the end, Catherine's story was never just about a mother's desperate prayer or a man's deal made in the rain. It was about the quiet ways faith weaves through lives, even when no one sees it coming. One moment of kindness, one act of surrender, had rippled outward and changed everything. A woman who had nothing gave hope. A child who was dying gave life. And a man who believed only in power found redemption in humility. Time moved on, but their story lived in every patient who walked through those hospital doors, every parent who prayed for a miracle, and every person reminded that grace can appear in the most unlikely forms. Sometimes the answers to our prayers don't come with thunder or angels. They come through ordinary people who, in a single act of compassion, become the miracle we were waiting for. And as the years passed, those who knew Catherine often said that when she smiled, you could almost see it, the quiet certainty of a woman who had learned the greatest truth of all. God never forgets a prayer whispered in the rain. Drop a heart in comment, like and subscribe my channel, and visit my channel for more interesting stories and videos.